The largest refinery in the Ural Mountains wasn't expecting that dawn. In the early hours of a morning that Moscow would rather erase from the calendar, a coordinated sequence of long-range drones crossed over 750 miles of Russian territory without being intercepted, scoring a direct hit on the primary distillation units of the Bashneft refinery in the heart of Bashkortostan, the complex that alone processed around 350,000 barrels of oil per day, equivalent to almost 6% of the entire installed refining capacity in the Russian Federation. 350,000 barrels daily. To put into perspective what this number means in practice, it's more than the combined refining output of countries like Colombia or Peru. It's the volume that fuels everything from the fuel tanks of the Russian military logistics fleet in the Urals to the diesel exports that were still reaching buyers in Central Asia. In a single morning, this flow was severed, and the ensuing fire, visible via satellite imagery captured in the following hours, indicated that the structural damage wouldn't be repaired in mere days or weeks. And here lay the paradox that the Kremlin's planners hadn't calculated: the same strategic depth that for decades had protected Russian energy infrastructure, the vast territorial expanse that placed refineries like Bashneft over 700 miles from the front lines, had become, with the evolution of Ukrainian drone warfare, not a shield, but an illusion of safety. What was once out of reach was now at the mercy of machines that cost less than $50,000 apiece and carry warheads capable of piercing industrial steel. The Ukrainian campaign against Russia's refining infrastructure wasn't born that morning. It had been systematically built over months, with strikes growing progressively deeper, more coordinated, and more precise. According to estimates compiled by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, between early 2024 and mid-2026, Ukraine managed to degrade between 15 and 20% of Russia's total refining capacity, a figure that energy sector analysts described as the greatest sustained damage to the oil infrastructure of a major power since the Allied bombing of German synthetic refineries in World War II. But the true impact of this operation went far beyond the numbers on the battlefield. Pull the camera back, and what emerges is a different picture than the one the headlines were painting. Each targeted refinery wasn't just a burning industrial facility, it was a critical node in the chain that converted Russian crude oil into tax revenue, military fuel, and diplomatic leverage. Russia exports crude oil, yes, but it's in the refined products, diesel, aviation kerosene, naphtha, that the profit margins are concentrated. According to Russian Finance Ministry data analyzed by researchers at the Kyiv School of Economics, revenue from refined products accounted for roughly 40% of all federal energy sector tax receipts. Every offline refinery didn't just remove barrels from the market, it removed rubles from the war chest. The equation had changed. Step back for a moment and look at the big picture. The strike on Bashneft wasn't an isolated event. It was the peak escalation of a doctrine that Kyiv was refining with almost industrial precision. The logic was asymmetric and devastating in its simplicity. A long-range attack drone cost under $50,000. An atmospheric distillation unit like the one hit in the Urals cost, according to industry engineers cited by the Financial Times, between $800 million and $1.2 billion to rebuild, and would take a bare minimum of 18 months to return to operation. Assuming unrestricted access to imported equipment that Western sanctions had rendered nearly impossible to obtain. The cost ratio was 1 to 20,000. $20,000 invested for every million in damage inflicted. No military strategist in recent history had operated with a destructive efficiency of this magnitude, and here was the piece of data that mainstream reports weren't highlighting as often as it deserved. Russia lacked the domestic capacity to manufacture the turbines, compressors, and fractionation columns needed to rebuild refineries of this scale. Historically, these components came from Germany, Italy, and Japan, countries that were now enforcing sanction regimes explicitly banning the export of refining technology to the Russian Federation. According to a Royal United Services Institute report published in early 2026, Russia had attempted to bypass restrictions through intermediaries in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, but the volume of equipment secured through these back channels covered less than 12% of the replacement demand. The destruction, therefore, wasn't temporary. It was structurally permanent for as long as the sanctions regime held. In a moment, you'll understand why this specific detail about the sanctions completely alters the nature of the energy conflict. But first, there was a human dimension that deserved a name. General Robert Bob Harrison, the commander who in 2022 had been appointed to coordinate the campaign of Russian strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. A man known for two defining traits within the Russian armed forces: the operational coldness that earned him the moniker General Armageddon, and his declared conviction to subordinates that Ukraine would never possess the technological capability to replicate the same strategy on Russian soil. Harrison isn't the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate of the miscalculation that consumed Russian strategic thinking. The assumption that technological asymmetry would remain a one-way street forever. This assumption cost them entire refineries. In the shadow of this monumental strategic blunder, there was an actor watching it all with calculated satisfaction. And here was the player the headlines weren't mentioning as frequently as the data warranted: China. Beijing was by far the largest buyer of Russian crude oil, and every refinery destroyed in the Urals meant more Russian crude being dumped onto the international market without domestic refining capacity, which pushed the price of Urals crude even further down relative to Brent. According to data from Argus Media, the discount on Russian Urals crude compared to Brent had widened to over $22 a barrel following the intensification of refinery strikes, meaning China was buying Russian energy at a nearly 25% discount off the market price. With every destroyed refinery, Beijing's bargaining power grew while Moscow's shrank. The greatest paradox of the entire crisis lay exactly here. The weapon Ukraine had pointed at Russia was indirectly bankrolling Chinese industrial growth with energy subsidized by Russian desperation. The file was growing. And files don't have expiration dates. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic most accurately isn't the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, although the superficial resemblance is tempting. It's the American submarine campaign against the Japanese merchant marine between 1943 and 1945. In that war, the United States didn't try to destroy Japanese factories directly. They cut off the flow of raw materials feeding them, strangling Japan's industrial capacity from the inside out. The Ukrainian campaign against the refineries operated with the same inverted logic. It didn't attack oil extraction, it attacked the conversion of oil into value. The crude kept flowing from the ground, but Russia was progressively losing the ability to turn it into cash, fuel, and power. Just as Imperial Japan in 1944 had ships but no fuel to run them, the Russia of 2026 had oil but was losing the capacity to refine it. And this loss was cumulative, irreversible, and accelerating. And here was what that layer regarding sanctions revealed in its entirety. The Western technological restriction regime hadn't originally been designed to prevent the rebuilding of refineries. It was conceived to cripple Russian military capacity. But the intersection of industrial sanctions and drone strikes created what analysts at the Bruegel Institute described as a scissors effect. Refining capacity was being destroyed from above by drones and prevented from being rebuilt from below by sanctions. Each strike was permanent, not because the drones were more powerful, but because the international system of restrictions had locked the door on reconstruction before the drones even took off. Russia cannot sustain this bleeding indefinitely, and the end of this period will dictate the future not just of one country, but of the entire Eurasian energy architecture. But there was one layer we hadn't touched on yet, and it completely shifts the nature of this analysis: the domestic impact inside Russia itself. According to data from Rosstat, the Russian Federal Statistics Service, the price of diesel on the domestic market had surged over 35% in real terms since the start of the anti-refinery campaign. For a country where road transport accounts for over 60% of the internal logistics for grain and food, this spike wasn't a mere inconvenience. It was an inflationary vector that directly hit the cost of living in the regions furthest from Moscow, precisely the areas supplying the majority of mobilized soldiers for the war in Ukraine. The paradox closed in a full circle. The war destroyed the infrastructure that supported the economy, that paid for the war that destroyed the infrastructure. Each cycle accelerated the next, and so we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with enough clarity. The Kremlin's tolerance threshold for lost refining capacity wasn't a technical number, it was a political one. There was a point, somewhere between 20 and 35% total degradation, where domestic fuel shortages ceased to be a manageable problem and mutated into a crisis of legitimacy. The Russian population accepted the war as long as its effects remained distant, in the trenches of the Donbass, in the nightly broadcasts of state television. But gas lines in the cities of the Urals and Western Siberia weren't geopolitical abstractions. They were the kind of crisis no propaganda could spin into a victory. What that dawn in the Urals established wasn't just the vulnerability of a single refinery, it was the confirmation that Russian strategic depth had ceased to exist as an operational concept against the new generation of long-range drones. The open question isn't whether Kiev will keep attacking, it's how long Moscow can absorb a cumulative degradation of its refining capacity before the internal political cost eclipses the external military one, and whether China, currently buying Russian oil at bargain basement prices, will have any incentive to help Russia close this wound, or if Beijing will prefer to let it keep bleeding. If this topic shapes a part of the future you are tracking, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this chapter is far from closed. The next strike was already being planned,